In the hands of one of the guardian spirits on the statue of Thomas Jefferson, sculpted by Moses Ezekiel in 1910, is a stone tablet decorated with Hindu and Jewish symbols, titled Religious Freedom, 1786. It bears the following 7 names for God: Jehovah, Allah, Brahma, Ra, Atma, Zeus, and God. This statue at the University of Virginia is a tribute to the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, penned by Thomas Jefferson. The monument expresses the larger implications of the success of this key document. The importance of the diverse names for the divine principle on the tablet is confirmed by the sculptor, who remarked in one letter, quote, "Under our government they mean and are all God, and have no other meaning, and have each an equal right and protection of our just laws as Americans." The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom is one of the 3 items Jefferson explicitly requested to be inscribed on his tombstone, reminding students of American history of the paranational implications of Virginia's fight for religious freedom in Jefferson's eyes. In this essay, we will contextualize and examine the principal philosophies and events that led to the establishment of the laws of religious freedom in Virginia, which influenced the U.S. Constitution, other state constitutions, and resonated around the world as a shining example of the new order of the ages. The process of securing religious freedom in the United States and scoring a resounding but temporary victory against future tyranny was not sweeping and instantaneous. It was not a product of unanimous consent and cannot be credited to any one genius among the founding fathers or to any one philosophy. This complicated result required a most improbable revolution and patient political efforts that often struck their gold out of the enduring strife between Christian factions in the colonies. The problem of religious freedom in post-revolution America blossomed into a series of policies and movements centered in late 18th century Virginia, with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison at the forefront. It is with excellent reasons that the 2 major documents authored by these gentlemen are referenced by the Supreme Court in cases of religious freedom. These are Jefferson's statute and Madison's memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments. These same texts were celebrated abroad as monuments of a surprising feat of liberty and represent the pioneering beginnings that distinguish the United States from its European cousins. The primary churches in the 13 colonies had been transplanted from Europe and were called established churches or state churches. Citizens were born members of these churches just as we are born members of countries. Of the 13 colonies that were established during the colonial period, 9 had established churches, but few states endured the level of religious persecution as that of Virginia, where the Anglican Church of England had been established as Virginia's church since the beginning of the 17th century. Those of other sects or of disagreeable religious views have been deemed dissenters. The term Anglican comes from the Latin term Anglicanus for English. The Anglican Church represents the Reformed Church of England that broke with Roman Catholicism in 1534. Anglicanism arrived in Virginia in 1607 with the colony of Jamestown, and as the established Church of Virginia, it grew and provided the standard religious background for the founders George Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. But all the aforementioned, like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, evolved to embrace individual versions of Deism, an Enlightenment-informed orientation to religion coupled with a firm grasp of the natural and universal rights of man. In colonial Virginia, leading up to the Revolution, you could not get married without a license from the Anglican Church, and Anglican ministers were paid through taxes regardless of whether or not you practiced a non-Anglican religion. From 1768 to 1774 in Virginia, there was an increase in the persecution of non-Anglicans. Baptist ministers were whipped, people were hauled into court and fined, particularly in the Piedmont region where the dissenter and vocal non-Anglican population was growing. By 1774, over half of the Baptist ministers in Virginia had seen jail time for preaching, and the same Anglican establishment doing the persecution later called upon the dissenters to take up the war effort in the delegation of 1775. In this same year, dissenting ministers were exempted from having to muster with the militia, just as Anglican ministers had been. In 1776, we see the postponement of the establishment tax, officially ended in 1779. In the summer of 1776, before a constitution is formed, the Virginia Convention drafted a Declaration of Rights, which contained freedom of conscience in Article 16, along with other major progressive policies. Quote, "All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience." All of these significant changes are milestones in the gradual process of liberalization, moving from persecution to toleration to freedom. One extract from the Baptist minister and abolitionist, John Leland, who lived in Virginia for many years, explains the setbacks to a Christian commonwealth and mere toleration. Quote, "The notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. Government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely, and see that one does not abuse another. The liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have a preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians." Recent scholarship demonstrates that Virginia's eventual establishment of religious freedom was partly effected through promises made to Baptists and Presbyterians before and during the Revolution. For even after the war, Anglicans tried to take back control with a more liberal tax that would, instead of going exclusively to the Anglican Church, be dispersed to select Christian churches at the taxpayer's discretion. This was the proposed General Assessment Tax of 1784, conveniently proposed at a time when Thomas Jefferson was abroad serving as the U.S. minister in France. But Jefferson's key ally, James Madison, fought this proposal and stalled it out in 1785, writing the pivotal Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments. Many Baptist ministers, like William Freneau, were opposed to all government involvement in religion because it reduced religion to worldly policy, wrongly influenced individuals to profess a faith that should be strictly voluntary. Many Baptist ministers were punished and fined for preaching without a license. The ability to marry without a license from the Anglican Church did not come until 1785. Human beings, however, need no license or rights other than those from nature herself to speak about God in any way and marry anyone they prefer. Indeed, this default neutrality naturally bestowed on human beings everywhere is part of the foundational argument for religious freedom taken up by Jefferson and Madison. However, we must be cautious not to conflate the movement of universal rights with the prevalence of French atheism that tainted the French Revolution with a great deal of murderous activity. Although Thomas Jefferson was dismissive of the miraculous and magical, and regarded the lofty abstractions of Platonists and Gnostics as nonsense, the morals of the ancient Jews as wretched, he was not without some degree of belief in superintending providence and supernatural influence. Quote, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation, is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference." It comes as no surprise that the founders were not univocal. not on policies of religious freedom, formation of government, or theological belief. What is of interest, however, is the philosophical orientation that prevailed over all the others and was passed into law when it mattered most, even if that philosophy was carried in the hearts and actions of a smaller number of highly educated statesmen. The level of nuance and education exhibited by Jefferson and Madison was hardly predominant in the colonies. Nonetheless, their straightforward approach, their appeasement to the persecuted, and alleviation of future injustice helped gain some 1,500 signatures on Madison's petition that stalled the proposed general assessment tax. The prevailing philosophy underpinning this gradual liberalization is often simplified under the rather unsatisfactory category of Deism. For our part, we must review the language itself and not the categorical spectrum that hammered home religious freedom with providential timing through a small number of well-positioned founders who effected the greatest political advancement regarding religion in Western history. As with all historical studies, one must be cautious to avoid generalized and simplistic presentations. When we encounter arguments that America's founding can be traced back to one particular group or doctrine or ideology, you can be sure this assessment is made in haste, out of ignorance, or perhaps from an unscrupulous or dogmatic standpoint. To say, for instance, that most of the founding fathers were deists, or even that the deistical fathers were deists in any uniform sense, also misses the mark, despite its heavy dose of truth. Deism, as a philosophical orientation to spirituality, and not really a religion itself, presupposes a distance from God and a kind of non-interference. But as we have seen, even Thomas Jefferson in rare moments entertained the possibility of supernatural interference, even though in his personal study Bible he reduced the New Testament to the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' moral sayings. To claim the United States was founded solely on Christian values, Masonic Universalism, secular rationalism, Enlightenment values, or specifically as a disestablishment from the state churches, is to oversimplify a result that required all of these streams of influence. What we find also in the Declaration of Independence, in George Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation of 1785, and in Philip Freneau's beautiful poem on the universality of the attributes of God, and at the colleges of Yale and Harvard in the immediate decades after the Revolution, is that the underlying philosophy of natural rights under a universal God that encompassed all nations ultimately prevailed over sectarian hopes for future establishment churches and dogmatism of various kinds. Let us first address Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, Query 17, where Jefferson explains the religious activity and diversity in the colonies, unfair laws and persecutions that created tension, and the goal of free inquiry that compelled him to champion religious freedom completely removed from government cognizance. Jefferson explains how the members of the English Church who first migrated to Virginia were flushed with victory over dissenting sects and were intolerant of their Presbyterian neighbors and the poor Quakers who fled persecution in England. Although smaller sects arrived to the colonies with hopes of religious freedom, only members of the predominant Anglican Church really enjoyed this freedom to the full in Virginia. Even still, these members were in no way out from under the thumb of the English crown or its taxes. In 17th century Virginia, various acts were passed that punished parents who refused to baptize their children, prohibited the assembly of Quakers, and punished those who were found harboring Quakers and delivering them into Virginia with imprisonment and, in rare, untracked cases, execution. Thus, in 1657, shortly after the Quakers, Thomas Thruston and Josiah Cole came into Virginia, they were quickly locked up and deported to Maryland. As Jefferson notes, quote, The Anglicans retained full possession of the country about a century. Other opinions began then to creep in, and the great care of the government to support their own church, having begotten an equal degree of indolence in its clergy, 2/3 of the people had become dissenters at the commencement of the present revolution. In truth, the percentage of dissenters, those who dissented against the Anglican establishment, was probably between 20 to 35% of the total population at the start of the revolution. By an act of assembly in 1705, people brought up in the Christian religion who denied God, the Trinity, or asserted a plurality of gods, or denied Christian dogma or the divine authority of Scripture, were, quote, punishable on the first offense by incapacity to hold any office or employment, ecclesiastical, civil, or military, on the second by disability to sue, to take any gift or legacy, to be guardian, executor, or administrator, and by 3 years imprisonment without bail. Jefferson rightly calls this religious slavery and states, quote, our rulers can have no authority over such natural rights. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods, or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. The solutions to previous errors by religious authority were free inquiry and reason. Jefferson says that Christianity could never have been introduced from the beginning without some degree of free inquiry prevailing among the Romans. He implies that if the government prescribed medicine and diet as it had done with religion in the past, the bodies of citizens would be in poor condition. Jefferson recognizes in the case of Galileo the ignorance and error of the intersection between church and government. For, quote, it is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. In Jefferson's perspective, differences of opinion are advantageous to religion, and different sects can be used to censor each other in the extremes. But he asks whether or not religious uniformity is attainable at all. Quote, millions of innocent men, women, and children, since the introduction of Christianity, have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned. Yet we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? To make 1/2 the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth. Let us reflect that it is inhabited by 1,000 millions of people, that these profess probably 1,000 different systems of religion, that ours is but one of that 1,000. Jefferson recognized the flourishing of Pennsylvania and New York at this time in terms of religion, caused by their unbounded tolerance. They had learned to silence religious disputes by remaining aloof to them. Quote, let us too give this experiment fair play and get rid, while we may, of those tyrannical laws. Jefferson warned that the times will alter again. Quote, our rulers will become corrupt, our people careless. A single zealot may commence persecutor, and better men be his victims. From the conclusion of this war we shall be going downhill. The shackles, therefore, which shall not be knocked off at the conclusion of this war, will remain on us long, will be made heavier and heavier, till our rights shall revive or expire in a convulsion. In this vital piece of evidence, we see plainly the anti-tyrannical, pro-reason sentiment that found no greater vessel for Jefferson than in his Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, originally drafted in 1777, carried through the legislature by James Madison, and passed into law in 1786. In summary, with brief extracts, using only the divine titles Jefferson used, quote, Almighty God hath created the mind free, and all attempts to coerce the free mind by punishments produce only hypocrisy and are departures from, quote, the plan of the holy author of our religion, who, being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do. This is the philosophy of natural rights, where reality, as it is used as a first principle. meaning there is an underlying implication and order already established in the human domain that needs no conclusion or correct opinions on our part in order to function perfectly. But as Jefferson writes, quote, "The impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who, being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, have established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time. This religious slavery has compelled people to part with their money and make material offerings to appeal to God Himself, when really this financial appeal is exclusively to the profit of men unfit to bear religious offices. Quote, "Our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry, that therefore the proscribing any citizen as unworthy the public confidence by laying upon him an incapacity of being called to offices of trust and emolument, unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion, is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right." Such limitations actually harm religion and the Church's efforts, which became so clearly the case for many Enlightenment thinkers in revolutionary America. How can a religion pretend to emulate or teach about God when it is tempted to become the monopolistic and worldly God itself? The not-so-obvious error in religious laws enforced by government is that it will, quote, "make his opinions the rules of judgment, and approve or condemn the sentiments of others only as they shall square with or differ from his own." For Jefferson, there was no capacity for human beings to consult the God of the universe directly about the particularities of political policy. These policies are drafted and enforced by human beings, not by gods, and so they are vulnerable to the same weaknesses of their human enforcers. Thus, if free argument and debate are perceived to be dangerous in the eyes of a religion, that religion is therefore not established on the same ground as human beings, and is not a universality common to and adaptable by all nations, but is a force of subjugation and tyrannical opinion, and can be a means for unworthy human beings to self-congratulate their way into a false throne above the masses, who they deem lesser in the eyes of God, when in reality God has made no overt judgment to support this conclusion. And as we find in the concluding act of the statute, quote, "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinion or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess, and by argument to maintain, their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. We are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right." Jefferson's statute was passed in 1786 while Jefferson was serving abroad as the U.S. minister to France. When Jefferson discovered the statute had become law, he had pamphlets of the statute printed and distributed throughout France to promote the prevailing religious liberty of his home state. And although this statute was passed in Virginia, 11 of the states of the country still at this time had some degree of established religion and state-enforced religious restriction. Virginia in this way established the greatest guarantees of religious freedom before any other state, and ironically, the statute actually paved the way for many evangelicals in Virginia to push for a Christian empire and use their newfound freedom to enjoy preaching to thousands during the Second Great Awakening. So why did the Reynolds decision in the Supreme Court in 1879 look back on specifically the statute and memorial and remonstrance out of Virginia to find the precedent and bedrock of America's religious freedom, found in the First Amendment and nationalized in the 1940s through cases like Cantwell v. Connecticut and Everson v. the Board of Education. It is because between 1786 and 1879, the statute and the memorial were talked about throughout the nation. Eulogies of Jefferson were given that simply reread his statute, not the Declaration of Independence. Pamphlets from other states imploring new migrants would use the opportunity of religious freedom as a point of persuasion and use Jefferson's statute for their reasoning. Kentucky incorporated the language of it into its constitution, and when Massachusetts, the last state to disestablish its state church in 1833, was in the process of liberalizing their religious policy, debaters used the documents out of Virginia to make their cases. Now we come to James Madison's substantial document that helped lead the charge for religious freedom in Virginia by successfully stalling out a bill for allocating tax funds to Christian teachers. This is the Memorial and Remonstrance, which spelled out 15 reasons for rejecting the bill and gained over 1,500 signatures as a petition, contributing to over 10,000 signatures on petitions against the bill. In this text, Madison fleshes out the philosophy of natural rights that would ultimately win the day in American law, using mostly deistic language. He deems mankind to be citizens of the, quote, supreme lawgiver of the universe, the, quote, universal sovereign, and, quote, governor of the universe, before they are members of any civil society or religious institution. Quote, the religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is, in its nature, an unalienable right. It is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending on only the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. It is unalienable also because what is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage, and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. Those rulers who, through derivative clergymen and second-hand, opinionated interpretations, seek to enforce obedience to dogma through civil law, are tyrants to James Madison, and the people who consciously or unconsciously end up at the whims of these clergymen are slaves. That people so inclined to grant such authority to a church and government may constitute at times a majority was not lost on Madison. For, quote, it is also true that the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity, in exclusion of all other religions, may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians, in exclusion to all other sects? Madison engaged quite the liberal and Enlightenment approach that proves ruinous to militant dogmatism, and is a testimony of profound faith in natural rights over man-made doctrine. Quote, whilst we assert ourselves a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion which we believe to be of divine origin, we cannot deny an equal freedom to those whose minds have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. Madison argued that it is not just an offense to man to attempt to force a belief onto someone, but it is an offense to God. He is not arguing from a strictly secular or rationalist stance, but one that emphasizes the importance of free will in God's design. Approaching law through the lens of natural rights is, therefore, taking into account the default status of the human being. The notion of a tax-funded and correct denomination pretending to be a representative of the truth universally stands in contradiction to itself when it requires the involuntary financial support of smaller sects and dissenting individuals. This is, quote, an arrogant pretension falsified by the contradictory opinions of rulers in all ages and throughout the world, the second and unhallowed perversion of the means of salvation. Another blatant contradiction is found in the apparent need for the Christian religion to raise funds and support through government intervention. Quote, "For every page of it disavows a dependence on the powers of this world." This understanding was familiar also to contemporary Baptist ministers like John Leland and Isaac Backus, who argued for religious freedom on the same grounds during the Revolution. As Benjamin Franklin also implied, any religion claiming to be established that requires human laws in order to survive is not indicative of it being a good religion. Madison submitted that to require these laws for itself actually weakens the image of the given religion and fosters rejection and lends to a, quote, "superstition that its friends are too conscious of its fallacies to trust it to its own merits." This suspicion doesn't come about based on flaws in the thinking of the suspicious individuals, and it did not come out of a vacuum, but as Madison notes, quote, "During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What have been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Just as religion should not require government intervention and taxpayer support, government does not require an established religion to perform its offices properly. But more would have been the results of church and state entanglement. What historical reasons might the educated population of a revolutionary government have to de-Christianize the government entirely? Quote, "In some instances they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of the civil authority. In many instances they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instance have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of the people." And foreshadowing the First Amendment's establishment and free exercise clauses, Madison states that government is best employed when it protects, quote, "every citizen in the enjoyment of his religion with the same equal hand which protects his person and his property, by neither invading the equal rights of any sect nor suffering any sect to invade those of another." Madison regarded the new proposal of tax-supported churches as a sad mark of sudden degeneracy and a beacon of warning to those seeking Virginia for religious asylum, to instead find another, more agreeable haven. This may also be regarded as a warning by contemporary Virginia citizens who believed the Revolution had provided the way for religious freedom, only to be blindsided by another establishment tax. Madison understood this to be of the same species of policy that depopulated the same kingdoms whose citizens fled or migrated to America. Quote, "Torrents of blood have been spilt in the Old World by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord, by prescribing all difference in religious opinion. Time has at length revealed the true remedy." This historically informed remedy was the relaxation of the constrictions of religious freedom, not a reinstatement of the same follies and seeds of persecution which had plagued so many previous countries that demonstrably were established in league with, or as a result, established state churches intermingled with monarchical tyranny and the tired silliness of the divine heredity of royal lineages. This is quite agreeable to the arguments of critical and positive deists, who not only refuse to imagine government coercion as a persuasive force in religious matters, but tend to take the point of view of needing to shed the old, rotting husk of established religions and their incessant denominations, low-stakes theological disputes and contradictions, and move forward with the acceptance of only the most foundational spiritual notions, leaving all else to the realm of curiosity and mystery. 5 weeks before his death, the long-standing deistical thinker and founder Benjamin Franklin responded to a letter from the Congregationalist president of Yale College, Ezra Stiles, with these words, quote, "Here is my creed. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs the world by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we can render him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be fundamental principles of all sound religion, and I regard them as you do in whatever sect I meet them. For Madison, the freedom of conscience is a gift of nature, and those who would enact laws to support their personal religious institutions at the expense of others are ignoring this natural right and ignoring the immediate dangers that led to the revolution. In all of the documents we've reviewed, the prevailing philosophy is one of natural rights that apply universally to all nations. Many movements and strains of thought and forward-thinking individuals contributed to the substrate of Deistic Naturalism. In regard to nature and her rights being observed in the act of establishing such religious freedom, Jefferson's theological antithesis, the Unitarian John Adams, likewise recognized the historical novelty of American religious freedom. Quote, "The United States of America have exhibited perhaps the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature. In the formation of the American state governments, it will never be pretended that any persons employed in that service had interviews with the gods, or were in any degree under the influence of heaven. These governments were contrived merely by the use of reason and the senses." Here we should distinguish between negative or critical deism and positive deism. Negative deism leans toward the approach to God that keeps him distant from his creation, and relies solely on an abstract and unknown level of providence for any continuous divine action, and generally dismisses revelation-based interpretations of reality. Critical deism likewise seems to afford itself its basic principles as a response to religious dogmatism, scriptural contradiction, and church-authorized or government-leveraged persecution. Positive deism tends more toward Enlightenment universalism, without necessarily accepting miracles, but seeing more divine interaction with physical reality in real time, and leaving room for revelation and divine experience, so long as it comports with reason. Benjamin Franklin demonstrates this positive deism with the statement that the divine, quote, "sometimes interferes by his particular providence and sets aside the effects which would otherwise have been produced by causes." Deism is by no means adherent to a strict doctrine, but rather a spectrum from skepticism and anti-dogmatism to the acceptance of God, soul, and providence, with limited conclusions beyond. Deism in its various forms saw its high point from roughly around 1750 to 1809, and should always be included in any discussion about the influential schools of thought contributing to the revolution and the theological backdrop of the United States. Famously among the sharpest voices of this time, affirming the same principles as Jefferson and Madison, who were foundational to the revolutionary effort, was the sharp and critical deist Thomas Paine. In the years following 1786, with the passing into law of Jefferson's statute, many Christian ministers were lamenting the increasing lack of audience at their sermons, while at the same time they attacked Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, wherein deism and critiques of Scripture were becoming, as one minister called it, a Bible for the ungodly. However, Thomas Paine wrote The Age of Reason also as an antidote to atheism, and the peculiar deistic naturalism he espoused can be found in the following extract, where we see that Paine was not an atheist or denialist, but rather saw in nature and the real world the activity of God that applied universally. Quote, "The Word of God is the creation we behold, and it is in this Word, which no human intervention can counterfeit or alter, that God speaks universally to man. The creation speaks a universal language, independently of human speech or human language, multiplied and various as they may be. It is an ever-existing original, which every man can read. It cannot be forged, it cannot be counterfeited, it cannot be lost, it cannot be altered, it cannot be suppressed. It does not depend upon the will of man, whether it shall be published or not. It publishes itself from one end of the earth to the other. It preaches to all nations and to all worlds. And this word of God reveals to man all that is necessary for man to know of God. Do we want to contemplate his power? We see it in the immensity of the creation. Do we want to contemplate his wisdom? We see it in the unchangeable order by which the incomprehensible whole is governed. Do we want to contemplate his munificence? We see it in the abundance with which he fills the world. In conclusion, we must think about the religious atmosphere of the colonies as one of a diversity of established state churches or smaller Christian sects seeking audiences and freedom to exercise their religion, coupled with a growing deistic naturalism among the educated elite. Specifically in Virginia, the statute and memorial did not result in clean breaks from government involvement in religious affairs all at once, but gradually helped to cement a way of thinking in post-revolution America and erected the wall of the separation between church and state. Nor did these documents prevent Protestantism from reaching its high point in Virginia in the decades to come, or keep the evangelicals from asserting the most audacious claims about the Christian destinies of America. But what we can know for sure is that the prevailing sentiments of nature's God and the universal sovereign in Jefferson and Madison, to those more piercing critiques from Thomas Paine and the gentle positive deism in Benjamin Franklin, contributed to the new elements of religious orientation in the United States. I close with a poem that represents more of this new theology, not one of a denial of divinity, but an affirmation of it, coupled with a healthy revitalization, broken free from the confines of dogma and man-made superstition. The poem, published in 1795, is called On the Universality and Other Attributes of the God of Nature. This was written by the friend and colleague of Jefferson and Madison, the so-called poet of the American Revolution, Philip Freneau, who has been remembered for suffering imprisonment on a British ship during the Revolutionary War and publishing many scathing critiques of the old empire during these vital years. All that we see about abroad, what is it all but nature's God? In meaner works discovered here, no less than in the starry sphere. In seas on earth this God is seen, all that exists upon him lean. He lives in all and never strayed a moment from the works he made. His system fixed on general laws bespeaks a wise creating cause. Impartially he rules mankind, and all that on this globe we find, unchanged in all that seems to change. Unbounded space is his great range, to one vast purpose always true. No time with him is old or new. In all the attributes divine, unlimited perfectings shine. In these enwrapped, in these complete, all virtues in that center meet. This power doth all powers transcend, to all intelligence a friend. Exists the greatest and the best, throughout all the worlds, to make them blessed. All that he did, he first approved. He all things into being loved. Over all he made, he still presides. For them in life or death provides. If you would like to support the channel, please find the links below in the description. Thank you, and be well.